So APIs. APIs, you can kind of think of it like I put JSON, like, usually getting JSON and XML. In general, if we're talking about like web APIs, it's almost always JSON. Like sometimes you'll get XML. There's some applications where you might actually have XML data, but for the most part, you can think of it like APIs. Almost everyone thinks JSON immediately. Okay, so the way you can think of APIs is kind of like communication. So basically the idea of an API is that we have an application to another application, right? Basically you send a request, you say, hey, to the other thing, right? You're one application talking to another application, like, hey, here's my request. Will you give me this information or give me this data? And then the other application will give you a response. And it'll either be data or it'll say, hey, yeah, I got your message, or I don't know what you're talking about. Basically some kind of response usually. And then, so what's kind of interesting is that APIs actually cover a whole lot of different things. It could be computer to computer. It can be computer to server. It can be like hardware to software kind of like stuff. It can be really interesting things. But some examples, financial transactions. So like whenever you click like, on like your little phone and you're like, hey, like buy this thing, and you click, like purchase, right? And it takes a second and then you see something kind of come up. That's because what likely happened is that your phone or whatever, right, the application you have has to send a request saying, hey, this person wants to buy this thing. Is it available? Is it all good? Can I say they bought it? They basically do some stuff on the side, like on the server. It says, oh, yes, you bought it. And then sends back and says, oh, you're all good. And this needs a little check mark or whatever. Okay. Also like posting to Twitter. So Twitter API is actually really a really fun one to play around with. You can pull information from Twitter. You can also post information onto Twitter, basically all through your computer and stuff like this. So Twitter is actually really useful to like grab like real-time data. And then also controlling IoT, which I have an example today of how you can actually kind of send requests and pull information from like Internet of Things. Okay. So just know that's always like a software to software interaction. So it's usually talking to one thing to another thing, but it's all through software. Okay, cool. And of course, stop me if you guys have questions and stuff like this. All right, so most of this stuff is review from the curriculum. That's why I'm not spending too much time on it, but kind of helps you out, right? So parts of an API. So one is access permissions. Basically, it's saying, is the user allowed to ask these questions? It's like, so for example, you have an API with a Twitter. You don't want just any, Joe Schmo being able to like tweet on your behalf, right? Obviously, they have to have the right permissions to do, to act like you. So access permissions, right? So a lot of times they'll have that. They also have permissions sometimes to check to make sure you are like, not you are a person, but basically so they can keep track of who's asking questions. Because if there's someone who's asking the same question over and over again very, very quickly, they're like, hey, whoa, slow down. We need to stop this person so we can let other people through. So that can also be part of it. The other parts of it is like, okay, API call and request. So a call / request, you'll hear people call it the same thing. Basically, it is a way to write code and you basically make an API call or make an API request, the same thing, to implement some task. So what's really nice, you can actually say, for example, like, I'll show you like with an IoT light example, is I can write some code and say, hey, turn on my lights to blue, change my lights to blue. Do I have to know exactly how to change my lights to blue? No, I just have to tell the server, hey, change my lights to blue, you figure it out, which is really nice in the sense that I don't have to worry about making some complicated program to figure out the exact intricacies of this particular product or service or whatnot. I can say, hey, just do this thing, or hey, just give me this data. And for the most part, it figures it out and sends it over. Kind of like SQL, if you remember back how we gave SQL commands and then SQL Server figured it out and then gave it back to you. Okay. Note that we also can have like methods and parameters, so you can actually say specific things. For example, like if you have an IoT, let's say automatic lock, right, on your door, you can say, hey, open up the door, and it can open up the door, like unlock it or something like that. You can also send parameters. For example, we'll see for an API light, well, you can say, like, oh, change the light to blue, change the light to, orange, change the light to green. You can send certain parameters, say what color you want to change. So you can send those kind of things. This also can be for requesting data. You can say, hey, here's a parameter, only give me the things that are most recent for 2019 in January, right? And you can then hopefully the server will actually understand what you're saying and it will give you that relevant information. Okay, and of course the last part's the response. Basically is saying the result of the request. So some results can actually be data, some results are just saying, hey, looks good, like it just gives you an okay. But basically there's always a call and a response. Okay, cool. Everyone sound pretty good so far? Okay, know that I will talk about this mostly in JSON, but APIs can technically be in other formats as well. Usually it's JSON or XML, but in general, you can probably assume it's JSON, but always read the documentation, right? So I will say, for example, I have worked with like other companies and stuff like this, where their application uses XML. So I have to use an XML API. So if I am not paying attention, I'm just trying to, oh, I'm just gonna use JSON, right? It's gonna give me an error. So just kind of be aware of those things. Okay, cool. All right, just kind of quickly, different API types. There's webs, like the web-based stuff. That's usually what we're talking about with an API. But technically there's also databases, operating systems, and hardware. We don't talk about operating systems and hardware just because like it's not usually as relevant for data science, but in general, when we're talking about APIs, we're talking about web stuff. So think of like the Twitter. Also, you hear this REST, right? REST API. Usually, we're talking about like interacting with a web server. So a client and a server. So client being the person who makes the request, this server being the thing that fulfills that request and gives the response back. Okay, and also have databases. So just know that there's also just other things that you can ask for a database. Kind of again, like I think if you look at SQL, you can kind of get an idea of like SQL and APIs. They're not the same, but it's getting pretty close. Okay, sound all pretty good so far? And I'm kind of just trying to rush through a whole bunch of this really quickly. So okay, so client-server model. This is actually a diagram from the curriculum. Basically, note that you are the client, the person who's typing out the thing, the request is being sent by the client. You can see here query, request, call. They all mean basically the same thing in this context. Then we have the server, basically some other hardware that's basically saying, hey, what's your request? Note that the server might do some extra stuff. It might do something like talk to other servers or talk to other, do other API calls and stuff like this behind the scenes. And we'll do stuff. You might wait a while and then it'll give you a response back. So note that this can take time, right? For us, it might seem pretty quick, but there is some lag between actually receiving the query and then actually doing something and then getting the response back. Okay, cool. All right. I just want to kind of mention about like what the client is. Sometimes people get confused about client versus server. Basically, like think of like when you're doing the web, it's the person who's like doing the stuff, right? So it's defined like what you're doing. Like when you click, like for example, like on Google and you start typing something in, like you're the client putting in a request, and then the server is going to kind of give you back a response. So that's kind of like what you're doing with like a lot of web stuff. Let's see here. Yeah, we're just gonna kind of go through this, but okay. So like you can imagine like on the website, like on the client, you put in something in there, you have some interaction with it, right? And then it's gonna send a request over to the server. Server then listens to like these requests through HTTP. So remember like, your URL, like it's a HTTP. This is a hypertext transfer protocol, if you're ever wondering. I think it's like a Jeopardy question, like way back, whatever. But HTTP, and then note that HTTPS, S just stands for, I believe, secure. Basically, it's just doing an encryption service on there. But in general, it's the same protocol, it just has encryption on there. This basically says, okay, it's looking for a request. It says, oh, someone gave me a request. All right, what do I do? It basically first says, hey, is this person who they say they are? Can they do these kind of things? Then I'll look at the request and say, okay, let me go look at the request. What are they asking for? Making sure it's all valid, performs any actions and all that stuff, processes all these things, and then says, okay, sounds good, and then sends a response back to the client. The response could just be like saying, okay. The response could be a whole bunch of data. Just kind of like know that response basically comes from the server while the client just kind of twiddles their thumbs waiting for the response. Okay. All right, sound pretty good? All right, cool. All right, just on database, basically it's the same kind of thing. Like think of like SQL Server. That's how I kind of imagine it. But same idea. So you have a request and you get a response. Okay, so, all right, so good. We have about 15 minutes, I think. For the record, I might go a little bit over so that you guys can play around with something in a second. But I just want to kind of go over this really quickly with HTTP request. So know that basically any request you like, for example, if you go online, go to google.com, you search for something, you get a request, right? Or you send a request and then you get a response back. You can do the same thing actually in Python. So you can actually use this package called request. And then I can actually say, okay, response equals request.get https.google.com. So actually going to the server, which basically when I go to google.com, this is actually what happens here. So if I just get Google, right, I get, oh, response. Oh, well, that's funny. I copied one extra thing. There we go. We get this, right? So like, okay, that was my request. We can also do this within Python. So I can say, okay, response equals request.get https google.com, right? So what happens here, you can see that took a little bit of a while, but came in. I can actually see what the type is response, and it actually has request.models response, so I can actually look at what this is. So the first thing I can say is, hey, was this okay? So for example, if I go like this, you're like, oh, cool, response 200. Note that there's different response codes. For example, the infamous 404 error, right? You guys ever get that sometimes? Like where you're like, oh, like I'm asking for something. The 404 error basically says, hey, that doesn't exist. Like, I don't know what to tell you. That's kind of a response code of, you know, for example, if I put something, let's see if I can make something up real quick that won't like do really bad things. It's not gonna work because it's boot. Let's see if I can do this real quick. I'll use my guy. Cool. So you see it's been through. Note that if I go to here, because this repository does not exist, you get 404, right? So if I look at the type response, I still get a response, but you'll see the response code is 404. So it's saying, hey, it doesn't exist. So all right, let me go back to Google. Cool, and we can check that all looks out, 200. And then this response code basically says, okay, if this is all good, now show me this. It's like, good, looks good. So now it's like, okay, but what did it do? Like, what was the response? So in this case, the response actually was literally the web page. So you can actually look at this if you know HTML. This is actually an HTML doc. This is actually like if I were to copy this into an HTML page, you would basically see this right here. That's kind of what's going on. So basically it's a response whenever you do like, you know, type in a URL, type enter, right? It's actually giving you a response. So you can actually do the same thing here. This is a little hint to us doing web scraping, you know, next week. Basically, we can use this kind of idea where we get the HTML that we would have seen and pull that in and scrape across and look for the relevant like gold nuggets of data. Okay. Note there are also things like headers, for example, some extra information about like, you know, what's going on here. So note, hey, look at our good old friend, JSON format, right? So you can see the date, for example, of this request. You can see some interesting stuff like expires, doesn't expire, cache control. So some extra stuff, you know, that could be relevant. Okay. And you can also see, for example, like since it's JSON format, I can just go ahead and get the date, the server, for example, GWS, Google Web Server. So you can see those different parts. Okay. Sound pretty good? Cool. All right. So note that we can also pass parameters. So sometimes, for example, we can actually pass in certain parameters, say, hey, give me this specific thing. You can play around with this like HTTP, for example, and like pass certain things. This is where if you see at the URL, you get like question marks and ampersands and stuff like that. That's kind of what you're doing here. In this case, this is a really nice practice one, HTTP bin. You can kind of practice some like what's called API requests and stuff like this. So you can see here, I'm basically passing in username Luigi, password Isla Peach, and then it'll actually give me a response. I'm getting the JSON response, right? Results origin. I'm putting this there so no one can see my IP, but it wouldn't be a big deal. But you can see all this information returns. In this case, it's all JSON format. Okay, and you can see this is actually, if this is the actual code here, I'm going to send this on the Zoom chat so you guys can play around with it. But if you put this in here, and if you go to that URL, you'll actually see basically this copied over, except the difference will be the origin will be your IP address. Okay, sound pretty good? Cool. All right. All right, so, let's see here. Last one. I won't actually be able to run this because I don't have these files, but you can also post things. So instead of just getting something, you can also say, hey, for example, an upload, you know, you can post this and actually pass this information. For example, when you fill out like a web form will be calling a post request. And the post request basically is the server getting some information and doing something with it versus just a parameter. Okay, if I run this, it won't work. So you can see file not bound because it doesn't exist. Okay, cool. Everyone sound pretty good? I know I'm kind of flying through. Hopefully it's not too crazy. We'll talk about more of some of this like request stuff as well for web scraping next week. Okay, cool. All right, so last part, and here I just want to mention OAuth. OAuth basically is a way to authorize who you are. So note that authorize in, oh, I always mess this up. Why can't I say this right? Authorize and authentication. So authorize basically allows you to say, hey, you are allowed to do this. Authentication is just saying, hey, you are who you say you are. So note that they're slightly different, but OAuth basically is a process to make sure you can actually authorize yourself and stuff like this. So sometimes you'll see OAuth, for example, you have to go through this process. I think the curriculum kind of shows how you do this with Dropbox. Basically, it's like another thing that will say, hey, like you have to prove that you actually are here versus like a computer just kind of clicking things. Okay. But usually once you have this part, it recognizes, okay, you've been approved, you are authorized, you are now have authentication. Usually authorization and authentication usually come hand in hand. Okay, cool. All right, so that is APIs introduction, really quick in like 20-ish minutes. I don't know if that's quick, but any overall questions before I move on to the example?